so the voice doesn't interrupt anyone. Okay, I will mute everyone, or you might want to choose to mute yourselves, except for Avital, who will be speaking. She will be happy to answer questions at the end of her presentation. If for any reason you're afraid you'll forget your question, you're welcome to put it into chat, but we will not interrupt Tali during her talk. All right.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. So nice to see faces that I don't see very often, and some faces I see all the time, but it's also nice to see those faces. I know that I'm not supposed to favor some of our speakers over others, or at least I'm not supposed to talk about having favorites, but I have to admit that I have a special place in my heart for the children of Becky, the folks who grew up in this congregation and who I've known for decades since they were learning to go up the stairs of the bima when they were toddlers. Somehow I believe that I am entitled to shep nachis over these adult children of my friends, and I hope the parents of tonight's speaker won't mind sharing their pride with me as I introduce Avital Sokolow-Silverman. Tali is a social worker at Jewish Family and Children's Services in Boston. She grew up in New Haven at Becky and is the daughter of Becky members Ina Silverman and Jay Sokolow. Tali will be talking about her recent trip to Israel with the combined Jewish philanthropies Boston Strong, Israel Strong Solidarity Mission. I will now turn the program over to Tali.
Thank you. Thank you, Shoshana and Rachel, for having me and organizing this, and for everybody for having me. I'm just gonna say that I woke up with a migraine this morning, so I'm a little bit more sluggish than I had hoped to be, so bear with me, please. I'm just gonna share, get that started. How's that looking? Good. All right. So I just wanted to say thank you again for having me. It's so nice to be back in a community, that I grew up in, as many of you know. And I'm going to talk about my experience being in Israel a couple of months ago. I was there from February 8th through 18th. And I just want to acknowledge before we get started that we just passed a very unfortunate milestone of 6 months of this war, and that my trip was 2 months ago, when we were 4 months into it. So I just want to kind of put that timestamp on it and recognize that we've been in this now for 6 months. Sorry, my slides aren't working. There we go. I'm going to do my best to share my experiences of what it was like for me to be in Israel and what I witnessed on the border. I'm going to try as hard as I can to honor the experiences of the people who shared their stories with me. But I do want to sort of emphasize that this is my experience, so it may or may not correspond with whatever you've heard and what you've seen. Different perspectives and experiences are all valid. And just to keep in mind that this is an invitation to really listen to maybe what might be a different perspective from what you've already hold. This is our agenda for today. I'm going to share my experiences and observations. I'm going to go chronologically, mostly using photos and videos to really lay out how my experience unfolded for me. And this trip was a little bit of a combination. It was a very last minute trip. I had about a week's notice. And part of it was me on my own, and part of it was with CJP, which is the Combined Jewish Philanthropies. It's the Jewish Federation in Boston. It's a really big federation. It's one of the largest in the country. And they ran about 3 missions in 3 weeks. To Israel and to the border, and to meet with survivors and families of hostages. And they were generous enough to take me along on one of them. I'm also going to share some of the themes that came up that I noticed. So some of them will be my experiences, and some of them will be things that I noticed in what other people said as well. And then, as Shoshana said, hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. I feel fine if you feel like there's a pressing or clarifying question you want to ask before the end. Let me know. I can't see any of you because I have my presentation open, so just feel free to unmute yourself if it feels pressing, or somebody can alert me if there's a message in the chat. All right, we're going to dive in. I'm going to start with my flight there, which seems a little bit overly detailed, I think, but I'm starting there because that's when I first really started noticing some of the differences of this experience compared to other experiences and trips I've had in Israel. The first few things that came up were that I flew a red eye from on El Al, and I was sitting in the gate and realizing there are no kids. And I don't know if any of you have flown El Al before, you'll know that most of the flights are full of kids, lots of different families flying. There were no children, and that really stood out. The other thing is it was a completely full flight. Every single seat was taken, but nobody was talking to each other. There was no geography happening. It was a very quiet and sort of solemn feeling on the flight, in a way that I've never experienced before. And lastly, the thing that really stuck out to me and sort of became a theme for me was the service was exceptional. And I know that might not seem weird, but if anyone's been on El Al or has been to Israel, you know that the service, they're not known for their service and kind hospitality. But this was one of the best flight services I've ever had. They were attentive, they were kind, they were smiling, they were grateful we were there. They were thanking us for being there. They seemed genuinely just so happy to be working and to have people flying to Israel. So that was sort of my first inkling of like, oh, things are different. This is different. When we got to the airport, it was eerily and astoundingly quiet. Our flight was the only one that was landing there. So it was completely empty aside from us. And when you walk into the airport, you walk first past this installation of dog tags. I wear one. Most Israelis wear one at this point that I saw walking around. And these are reminders of all the hostages who are still in Gaza and or who died waiting to come home. As you walk past this installation, you walk down this now sort of famous installation of hostage photos in this hallway towards passport control. And this was just a really moving, I had seen a lot of pictures of this hallway. A lot of people had posted pictures of arriving in Israel, but I don't think it prepared me for what it actually felt like to walk past and through these hostages as I entered the land, knowing that they weren't entering. This is the other side of the hallway, and I included this picture because of this sign right here that says, it's probably hard to see, but says protected area. There are signs for protected area everywhere, which did not used to be the case. And protected area is equivalent to a bomb shelter. The other thing I noticed with this, and this is true everywhere, that there are signs now for bomb shelters and protected areas, but if you pull up Google Maps too, even if you don't type anything in, it automatically populates with where all the bomb shelters are around. So that was a little bit different. And it was one of the things that, I had also felt like, oh yeah, I need to be aware of what to do and where to go. So I had this sort of inkling, like this is a different trip and experience on the flight. But as I got off the plane and I got out of the airport, I took a bus to the center of Tel Aviv, to the Arlazarov bus station, and it was about a 15-minute walk to my hotel. So I figured I'd walk. I hadn't slept at all on the flight. Had looked very much like I hadn't slept in 30 hours. I had my suitcase with me with my halal tags. I had my neck pillow. I very clearly had just gotten off a flight, right? And started walking, and a woman stopped me and asked me in Hebrew which bus to take somewhere. And I was exhausted, and I was just, I responded in English to make it very clear that I had no idea how to help her. And I just didn't want to deal with it. And I said, like, I'm sorry, I don't know where it is. And she did a full double take and looked at me, and I realized she was surprised to hear English. And she had automatically spoken to me in Hebrew, which I didn't register either until after that. And that was something that happened to me a lot throughout the week. And something else that I noticed and sort of became a theme is that there had been at that point, we're now 2 months later and a lot more people have gone to Israel. But at that point, there had been so few tourists and so few foreigners that everybody automatically spoke to me in English. I'm sorry, in Hebrew, assuming that I was Israeli. And then when I responded or said something in English, did a full body double take and would say something like, "Oh, you're a tourist? Are you American?" And that happened many, many times, every shop I went into, and everybody who stopped me to ask me a question. When I got to the hotel, I had similar surprise from them. Like checking into the hotel, I checked in English and they sort of did double take and then checked me in. And as they were checking me in, they thanked me for being there. And I thought that was just bizarre. And I was like, thank you for being here. So I thought that was also, and that happened a lot. People really thanked me for being there. And then as I was walking through the hotel to my room, started realizing that everybody around me was speaking Hebrew, which is kind of surprising in a hotel in the city center in Tel Aviv. And I learned later that all the other guests who were staying in that hotel were Israelis who had been displaced and were, and that's true for most of the hotels in the area. Another thing I started noticing on my walk to the hotel and around Tel Aviv that day, I arrived there on Friday afternoon, just before Shabbat, is that there are signs for the hostages and about the war everywhere in Tel Aviv. Every single block, every single wall, every fence has some sort of poster, sign, graffiti, something about the hostages and the war. And these were just a couple of examples I started noticing literally just walking the 15 minutes to the hotel. The one on the right says, "Machzirim otam habayta achshav," return them home now. The one on the left is actually the view from my hotel room. It says, "Yachad natzech," together we will win. But literally every wall, every surface, you can see the hostage posters here. A lot of buildings have absolutely just enormous 4-story posters printed, and you can see the giant Israeli flag next to it. The scale of it is massive and it is everywhere. You cannot forget that there are hostages or anything about the war, even if you wanted to. It was Friday night, and I was very lucky to have Shabbat dinner with Ariel Demry. Some of you might recognize him or remember him. He was an emissary who lived with us for a year, and he worked at Ezra and in many of the Jewish communities. He came to Becky with us, so you might remember him. He says hi. And it was one of those things that was just so nice to be with the people I had worried about for so long. He and I have stayed in touch, and we had talked a bit earlier on, and just after October 7th, about everything that was going on. And I had been holding so much worry and fear for him and all our other friends and our family for 4 months. And it was just really relieving, I think, to be with them and say like, oh, like you guys realize you're okay. Like you're alive, you're here, you're okay. You're living your lives. And that was a really, really, I think, relieving moment for me. And one of the interesting things that he said was he felt really lucky that they had just moved into this apartment that they were in before October 7th, because there's a bomb shelter in that building, and their old apartment building did not have one. So running to the shelter several times a day for 3 months was a lot easier than it would have otherwise been for them if they hadn't luckily just happened to have moved. So that's something that I think is a reality for a lot of people who live in a building without a shelter. I spent Shabbat the next day just wandering around Tel Aviv and feeling just sort of really reveling in that feeling of like, oh, people are okay. People are here. People are living their lives. Shabbat is peaceful. It feels peaceful. Both these pictures are from Sarona Market in Tel Aviv. The one on the left, this kid is just playing by the pond and throwing rocks in. And the one on the right, people are working out at an outdoor gym which is right next to McDonald's, which I just thought was funny, to have a gym next to a McDonald's. And I think I started realizing how much fear, existential fear and worry I had been holding on to for not just the 4 months of the war, but for months before that too, right? Before October 7th, October 6th, the country was on the verge of a civil political war, and people were really going at each other in different ways. And so there was a lot of existential threat building up to that of what's going to happen in Israel, what's going to be there. And I think, then a different type of existential threat after October 7th, when we realized how vulnerable we are there. And so walking around on Shabbat and realizing people are just enjoying their life was such a relief for me from that existential threat that I had been carrying. And I think that was the first time I really felt like a weight lifted in that way. And it was great. It was a beautiful, peaceful Shabbat, and I loved it. The other parts of it, though, that sort of came up for me wandering around, are realizing that there's really this theme of duality going around, like for me, that came up. I just started noticing different things. Like I noticed the dichotomy between beauty and horror, and the duality of like the devastation and the preservation, the trauma, the resilience, tragedy and joy, and how relieving it was, but also how haunting some things were. And I think these next few pictures are just me trying to share with you that experience of that duality that was really, really hard to express. I think when I came back from this trip, a lot of people asked me how it was. And it was really hard for me to answer because of this duality that really just permeated every aspect of it, like really some contradictory feelings and things going on. And I finally came to understand that my experience was in many ways like contrasting. And I think, I'm now a little bit better able to express the ways in which it was like both joyous and devastating and relieving and distressing. And I can name that it was both beautiful and haunting. But I think, I'm hoping to give you a sense of how I started experiencing that like liminal space of being in between and experiencing both at once, of the horror and the beauty, and trying to make sense of that. And these pictures, the one on the left, I was just struck by the beauty of this tree and stopped to take a picture. I really enjoyed looking at it, and then got to this, less than a block away, these teddy bears with blood on them, with pictures of the children who were being held hostage, and the reminders everywhere in the city that like there is beauty, and there's this inviting bench next to this beautiful tree, and there's also art everywhere reminding you that there's horror. This is Dizengoff Square, which for those of you who aren't familiar with Tel Aviv, it's a pretty famous popular plaza where a lot of people go to enjoy, also to demonstrate. This fountain had been turned into sort of an ad hoc memorial for victims of the Nova Festival. There's teddy bears all around it. There's photos of people who died there. There's notes from people. There are messages from people. There's reminders from loved ones about how much they're missed. And it just really struck me to have, all these people. It was a beautiful day weather-wise, and all these people picnicking and relaxing next to this memorial for those who died at Nova, and this giant poster of the hostages missing, and just the acknowledgement and constant reminders around the city that in some ways life goes on, and in some ways life is standing still. This is a photo of the fountain, and I chose this one because of these two people with their bikes on the right. This was a really moving moment for me, because I was sitting and enjoying a coffee and just relaxing in the sun. And this woman and her partner biked up and stopped, and she pulled a photo of her friend off of the memorial and showed it to her partner. And I could see her crying, telling him about her friend, and sharing in a moment of grief together. And then she put it back and they biked away and they continued on their day. And it lasted maybe all of 2 minutes. But I think it really was moving to see, this is how Israelis are living. They're pausing for grief and then returning to life, because that's what you have to do in order to continue. And that sense of deep grief and trauma, combined with the resilience. This I thought was also just poignant. This dad who's sitting on a bench taking care of his baby and attending to his baby, while there's a reminder with a teddy bear of the baby who is not home with his parents or being cared for by his parents, and he's being held captive. This is in the Azrieli Mall. Just to kind of give you a sense, there are hostage posters and reminders literally everywhere, like every single surface. There's not this statue is not just has a hostage poster on him, but also a yellow ribbon signifying hostages tied around his wrist, and then a woman living her life, right, and continuing. This too, just a sense of beauty at the beach, guy taking in the sunset next to the hostages and reminders of them. And the building on the right, I included because I think this sort of spoke to also the relief I felt resolving the existential threat of this poster that says Yachad Nenatzeach, together we will win, on this building being constructed, a new construction, and just the idea that, like, yeah, we can build new buildings here because we're going to be here. Israel's still going to be here. We're going to win, and it's going to be, life is going to go on in some way. It might look a little bit different, but I think that letting go for me of that fear a little bit and realizing, like, Israelis are continuing to build with the assumption that it will be fruitful. I stumbled Motzei Shabbat, Saturday night, into this protest by accident. I just was walking through the city and found it. It was in the courtyard of the Tel Aviv Theater. And I learned later that there is a protest there every Motzei Shabbat, every Saturday night. But this was actually the biggest one they had had in weeks, with thousands and thousands of people convening to this protest. This was just the beginning of it. And they later shut down the highway and had bonfires and all the things that you hear about. But some of the signs, it was interesting because people were protesting for different things, but alongside each other. There were people calling for elections now. There are people calling for hostages released. There are people calling for more action in the war and saying that we're responsible now for winning. So it's sort of an interesting mix. The people on the bottom are covered in blood, and they're holding signs that say the time is killing them, referring to the hostages. These pictures I included because this is Sunday and I had a beautiful day on Sunday. I got to see many, many friends and have delicious food. The weather was gorgeous. And I got to sit on the beach for sunset, where I had stumbled on a pull-up competition and these very fit men doing gymnastics in the water. And it was just very cinematic and gorgeous. And this boy just playing soccer. And I think it was just one of those moments of, like, yeah, life is going on. People are enjoying. And in my mind, I think I had been, my reference point for Israel was footage from October 7th. And that was really the last sort of video or imagery I had in my mind. And so it was really refreshing for me to remember, like, it's not just the violence of one day. Like, there's a lot of beauty in this country. And just that reminder was really helpful for me, especially as this was Sunday night and leading into Monday, which is when our mission began and when the CJP group arrived. So I met up with them on Monday. This was a really interesting day to meet up and begin our mission, because Monday morning, as we awoke to the news of the 2 hostages who had been rescued overnight. And so this was a really, really interesting day to begin, especially because we started our mission at the Hostages and Missing Families Forum. So this was our very first stop, hours after learning of the rescue of the 2 hostages. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Hostages and Missing Families Forum was founded on October 7th. It didn't exist on October 6th, obviously. But it came together very, very quickly, comprised of thousands of volunteers with specialties, people like donating time with their legal time, their PR, chefs, medical care, a lot of different people, thousands of people who are donating their time and expertise to helping families find their missing loved ones and advocate for them, and caring for these families as well. One of the things that became a really large theme, and this was sort of the first stop, or the first real understanding that I was building of this theme, is the real theme of government failure here around October 7th, and citizens, private citizens, and American and world Jewry, international Jews, stepping up in the government's stead to support everybody who needed support, from hostages to hostage families, to survivors, to victims, to the entire country who is now dealing with massive trauma, to soldiers. Everybody has soldiers in their family, and all of their families, and all of the ongoing physical, mental, and emotional trauma that is going to be a massive epidemic in the country. This is Shelley Shemtov. She spoke with us at the Hostages and Missing Families Forum. She's the mother of Omer Shemtov, who was abducted from the Nova Music Festival. I'm not going to share her story right now, just for the sake of time. She's been very active in sharing her story publicly in hopes of helping the hostages return. But one of the things that I will share with you is my experience of sitting with her and hearing her share her story with us, was how helpless it felt, and how helpless I felt, and how hard it was to sort of just, the only thing that I could do was listen to her share her story, and feeling really inadequate in that way. I think also it was really hard this day specifically to be meeting with her and to be talking with her, because 2 hostages were rescued and we were celebrating that, but they weren't her son. And how hard that was to both celebrate it, and also the pain I can imagine her feeling, like, oh, they could rescue people, but they won't do it for my son, or they can't for my son, and what that might have been like for her that day. This is the kitchen in the Forum building. The Forum building was actually a startup called Checkpoint. It's their building, and they donated space in their building for the hostage headquarters. This is the kitchen where families of hostage members come when they need to take a break, when they need to eat all their meals. They use it as sort of a living room. You can see some family members are there now. Usually it's volunteers who come and cook for them today, or this day. They had a celebrity chef who was there donating food and time from his restaurant to cook for their families. We then went to Hostage Square. Hostage Square is sort of in the courtyard, outside of the Tel Aviv Art Museum, and it's a series of art installations about the hostages and reminders of them. And these were just some of the more poignant ones that stuck out to me. This is called the Shabbat Table. It's an art installation that's become sort of ubiquitous across Israel and in cities in America, replicated in many cities in Israel. One end of the table is the Shabbat table set and waiting for hostages to return. And the other end is their table setting has rotted, waiting for them to come home. And they've died before being able to come and return to this Shabbat table. These are just some other installations and memorials. There was somebody protesting the Red Cross. There was a lot of news about the Red Cross not being involved in the hostages in the way that Israel and Jews had hoped they might be that week. This is a tent full of smaller tents. This is where actually a lot of the hostage families sleep and live, and have been sleeping and living for the past 6 months, at that point 4 months, since October 7th. And a lot of families have committed to sleeping here and living here until their family members are returned. And so the Hostage Family Forum is around the corner, and that's why they're all living in these tents. They can go to that building and eat their meals and take showers and take breaks from being in the public eye. After we left some of the hostages, we went to Hagal Sheli. This is, which translates to my surf or my wave. And this was a um, organization that actually did exist before October 7th. They had provided surfing therapy for troubled youth for many years. And since the war started, they expanded greatly using funds from CJP, which is why we went to visit them. And they've pivoted to offering surf therapy for survivors, for displaced families, and for soldiers. And the soldier in this picture shared his story of he was at the Nova Festival and he escaped and spent weeks in bed. He wasn't able to get out of bed. He was depressed. He was traumatized. He was terrified. He was having constant panic attacks. He never felt safe. And his friend connected him to Hagal Sheli. And he really credited Hagal Sheli with his word was his rehabilitation. He said, you know, when he's surfing, surfing really helped him learn not only that he can't control the world around him, but only how he responds to it. In the same way that you can't control the waves around you, you can only respond how you can only react, you know, with your surfboard. But it also gave him time throughout the day where he was fully focused on something in a way that his brain couldn't panic. So he was, you know, found those to be very comforting and very helpful. And he said, you know, Hagal Sheli got him to the point where he had actually just rejoined the army. And when we asked if there was anything he wanted people to know, he said he wants people to remember that everyone at the Nova Festival was there because they wanted to dance and enjoy the music and feel joy together. You know, we really remember them as victims at this point, and he wants to be remembered as somebody who is seeking joy, and he thinks that all of the victims want to be remembered that way, as people who just love to dance and love to party and have a good time, and that's what they were there for. This conversation with the staff and the clients at Hagal Sheli also continued the theme that I began hearing with the Hostage Family Forum of the government's failure to prevent the attack in the first place, to protect the people on that day and for the days after, to respond and to support its soldiers and its citizens in the aftermath with their trauma. And that really it's private citizens, that's private citizens and the international community and federations across the world that have stepped up to be able to expand agencies like this to meet the rising need for mental health care. Sorry, I'm just going to pause for some water. We left Hagal Sheli, and that was the end of Monday night. Tuesday morning, we headed down south to the border with Gaza, the border envelope, and we spent the day down there. I included a map here just to give you a sense of where Kibbutz Kfar Aza is. It's called Kfar Aza because it's literally village of Aza. Aza is the Hebrew word for Gaza. It is on the border with it. It shares a border. You'll see in photos of Kibbutz Kfar Aza where the border is. I'll show you the actual fence where they came in on October 7th. And I included this photo on the right of the flowers because I think one of the things I didn't realize either was just how stunningly beautiful this area is. It was in full bloom. It was lush. It was green. There were flowers everywhere. It smelled delicious and fantastic. There were birds chirping. It was just, you could see why people want to live there. It's just truly like the closest I think you could come to Eden in your mind. It's a beautiful, beautiful area. And I think that in some ways made it almost harder to take in some of the horror that was there. And really, again, this theme of duality, that beauty and horror that just permeated everything. This was driving just up to Kibbutz Kfar Aza. My experience of driving up was feeling a little bit worried about what I was going to see. I wasn't sure, you know, I had seen footage from October 7th that I had found very disturbing and haunting. but I wasn't sure what it was going to feel like to actually be there. I was a little bit worried that it would feel voyeuristic, and I didn't want that. I also just wasn't sure what was going to happen. There had been rockets just before we got there, and so I wasn't sure if we were going to be running from rockets also, and if that was going to be part of our experience. So I think there was just some worry about what this experience was going to be like. This photo on the left is the gate going into Kibbutz Kfar Aza. There's soldiers there because it is not open to the public, and they clear everybody. The only people who are going into this kibbutz at this point are people like us who are with a group that was prearranged with a tour guide who is a member of the kibbutz. You'll meet her in a second, or people who are volunteering to clean the kibbutz. And so they had cleaners come. They were cleaners there that day as well, who had arrived to help scrub the kibbutz and try to clean people's homes so that when they do return, they're not confronted with the horror that they left there. The sign on the right is just a sign reminding people that it's not a safe area and they don't recommend going in, which I thought was just funny as we were walking in. This is Chen. She was our tour guide. She is a member of Kibbutz Kfar Aza. She was actually on vacation with one of her sisters in Portugal on October 7th. And she was wakened in the very early hours of the morning in Portugal by the Red Alert app going off. That's the Red Alert app. When rockets are fired, Israel has a very sophisticated rocket detection system that provides alerts both in real time. You can hear the blaring. It says red alert, run for cover. And there are apps that will also play. So she was out of the country, but was still getting those alerts on her phone. And she said she awoke and realized, they often have rocket and red alerts, but the volume of them was completely different. And so she knew that something was going on and something was different about that day. Her father called her shortly after, and she ended up spending hours on the phone with her father, listening to the shooting and explosions in the background as her father ran trying to save his own life. And just what stuck with me about her story was just the helplessness of sitting on the phone and listening to your family be attacked. And just I can't imagine what that was like for her, despite how generous she was in sharing it and how generous she was in sharing about her family, and not just her immediate family, but her family of the entire kibbutz. Kibbutzim are oriented around community and communal life. And so everybody is extremely connected to each other, and just how devastating it was for her to have been away and come back to a lot of her family and community gone. And I also included this photo in the back of these beautiful flowers and the bikes that were left as they were on October 7th. Just again, it was a beautiful, beautiful place. And the birds were chirping, the weather was gorgeous. And just sort of hearing Chen's story, standing here in this gorgeous place, and that how hard it is to sort of hold both of those things. Chen told us about, the efforts that were made to protect everybody's lives and the heroic efforts of their security team. She said, they have many layers of security and protection, like everywhere in Israel, but especially because they literally have a border with Gaza and they do face regular rocket fire. They have a lot of infrastructure for protection. And she said, it's like all the stars aligned against us, with every layer of security and protection being breached in some way that has never happened before. She also noted that the cemetery that they have is not going to fit everyone. And one of the first things that they're thinking about as a community is how to expand it so they can make sure that they have all their family back home with them in some capacity. One of the other things that really stuck with me that she said was, this attack is now the benchmark for future attacks. Like, they have the playbook now of what works. They know what's successful and how terrifying that is for her. They know what works. And they're going to do it again, probably, or keep trying. This beautiful grassy area is just in front of Khan's house, and it's where a lot of terrorists landed by parachute. Actually, just to the left of this grassy area in the picture. And this is where many members of the security team were ambushed as they ran. I'm going to go into some photos of the damage and destruction that we took in on Kibbutz Kfar Aza. And I just want to walk, I sort of tried to set it up in a way that it's really hard to convey through photos. Photos are very two-dimensional. A lot of you have probably seen photos. These are crappy iPhone photos because that's what I had. And I wasn't, I'm not a professional photographer. I wasn't there to take professional photographs. These are just as I was walking candidly, capturing what I was seeing. And I think one of the things that's hard to convey is how much of a complete sensory experience it was to be there. There was the visual, right? There's the sights of the beauty and the flowers and the destruction and the savagery that's obvious in the photos and visual, but there was also like the sound of the birds chirping. There were explosions going off in the background frequently. There were Chen was occasionally telling us the story of specific teenagers or family members who she knew about. There was a smell. There was the smell of fresh flowers. It had just rained recently for 2 weeks in Israel. And so which is one of the longest rains on record there. But it also meant that everything was exceptionally lush and green and gorgeous. And so there was the smell of the flowers, but there was also a very strong smell of burning and ash in a way that I could not possibly have anticipated would still be there 4 months later. But it smelled like it was actively burning still.
Holly, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Holly?
Yes, please.
Oh, it was a few slides ago, but you had something about benchmarks, like it was a benchmark for, I didn't quite get what attack
Chen was saying.
benchmark. Did you mean, or did she mean like it was a benchmark for the terrorists to know how best to attack us in a terrible way?
Yes,
Okay,
that's exactly right. That this is
Okay.
now the benchmark for what a successful
okay,
attack could look like and how successful they could be, and that they have the playbook for what works now, right? The other thing that you'll, as I was walking through that I noticed is just how rapidly my heart was beating and how hard it was to breathe, not just because of the smell of burning, but just how affecting it is to really see the damage in person that I also don't think I anticipated. The other thing I just want to say is these are real photos of what happened. There is a video. Please take care of yourselves if that is going to be too much for you or too hard to see, or if it will be hard to hear some of the sounds. There might be explosions in the background of the video. Take a moment, take care of yourself, walk away, mute your screen, whatever it is that you need to do. This is the youth village at Kibbutz Kfar Aza. Every teenager on the kibbutz receives their own little apartment in this village when they turn 18. It's a joyous celebration of building independence and some separation from their family, and they move into their own apartment before going to the army, and they get to come home to their own apartment and hang out with their friends. And it's a really cute little village right directly on the border with Gaza. So they share their view from their apartments is Gaza. And these, I'm just going to go through some of the photos of what it looked like on that day. This photo, you can see it's a little maybe hard to see, but that fence right there, there's the village on the right, there's some apartments on the right, there's apartments on the left, and just past the apartments on the left, you can kind of faintly see that fence. That's the border fence with Gaza right there, to give you a sense of how close everything is. kibbutz chose to put signs about whose home was whose and who was murdered and who was abducted from their homes here. You can kind of see in this picture how charred the wood is, and I think get a sense of really just that smell of burning that is going to stick with me forever. Was just so powerful and really permeated the air around these apartments. This one just sort of really took my breath away of just the sheer number of bullets in this one person's apartment, and walking through their apartment, their stuff's still there, and just how many bullet holes. I can't imagine. Yeah, just really deeply affected me, I think. This is a video. I think there might be some explosions that you can hear in the background, but they're probably very faint, just for a content warning. But I play it just so you can get a sense of like the birds chirping, also, and a little bit more of that sensory experience of what it was like. This is the border fence. This is where they breached to come into one of the places where they came in directly into the youth village. And you can see the fence along the edge of the kibbutz. I include this one because you can see the smoke in this one in the background of an explosion that had just gone off in Gaza. There was quite heavily artillery fire while we were there in Gaza. Imagining what that's like for not just people who lived in Israel, but also for the people who are living in Gaza, and how hard that is to listen to and be subject to all the time. There was also an interesting moment. We were standing right here and just sort of thanking Chen and hearing the ends of her, what she had to say, and wrapping up and getting ready to leave. And she suddenly stopped and she was like, "Don't move." And we all froze in pure fear. And she went and wiped a bug off somebody's leg and was like, "Okay, you're good." And it was just sort of a funny moment of like, you know, the state that we were all in after seeing all of this and being there, and explosions going off of like, "Ooh, oh shoot." But it's just a bug. And that really elevated state of hypervigilance and fear that probably most Israelis are living in today. We went from Kibbutz Kfar Aza to the Erez border crossing. Some of you might have heard about the Erez border crossing in the news recently, because I think they are working on reopening it, especially to get aid through into Gaza. It's on the north side of Gaza, as you can see in the map photo. This was a very important main artery for people to move between Gaza and Israel before October 7th. This is where like the border control was for Gazans who, a lot of people don't know, but there were a lot of Gazans who traveled into Israel daily to work in various fields, including the literal fields of many of the kibbutzim in the area. A lot of people work in construction and really all around Israel in various places. And they mostly came through here for that work. It's now an active military base. This is the entrance. As we were waiting outside the entrance on our bus for clearance to go in, this armored truck came to like a screeching halt, and a soldier in like full garb came out, and he got on the bus and he was like, "Are you guys from Boston?" And we were like, yeah, we are. He's like, I'm from Brighton. I saw the CJP sign in the window. And just sort of a funny, Jewish geography moment as we were going in. He had chosen to make Aliyah and join the army. The Erez border crossing was also heavily attacked on October 7th, killing a lot of soldiers there. The difference between Erez and Kibbutz Kfar Aza is that people aren't currently living in Kibbutz Kfar Aza after the trauma. At the Erez border crossing, it is an active military base, an army base. So there are soldiers who are living there and living in barracks directly next to these, which, as you can see, they're still left as they were from October 7th, burned out. The smell of burning, again, just really in the air. But there are teenagers who are in the army, soldiers, people who are sharing a base with this trauma. And this is the actual passage currently for the army to go into and out of Gaza. This vehicle was just returning from there. This is the terminal building. So this is where a lot of the terrorists came in on October 7th and crossed into. You can see just the massive number of bullet holes in the glass in the terminal and everywhere. It essentially, this is a very quick video, but it's essentially, just kind of looks like a passport control terminal, but with bullet holes and broken glass and blood stains everywhere. I'm actually going to skip the video because I think you get the idea. This guy, Dudu, runs a volunteer unit of reservists who rehabilitate old tanks and make them usable again, because Israel had a really big shortage of tanks at the beginning of the war. And so this guy, who was in a tank unit when he served in the army, called the army and was like, I got a bunch of guys, let's fix up old tanks. And the army said, okay, thank you. And so they fixed up this tank and this one, which are being used in the war currently. These I just thought were really interesting. The pans in the refrigerator say parv or chalavi, indicating like dairy and parv dishes. And it was just sort of those like only in Israel moments. We had lunch on the army base with a lot of the soldiers. I got to sit and speak with Yankel, who is Dati, he's an Orthodox man serving. You can see his Star of David, Magen David, on his gun there. He's wearing tzitzit, fringes, ritual fringes, and just really interesting to talk to him. I had asked him, like, is it harder to be Dati in the army than it is for those who are secular? And he said it wasn't when he served in the army. He was in a Haredi unit. And so they had like a separate army base without women. They had food that he could eat. But now he's been called up for reserves. He's in Miluim. And now it's much harder because he is on a base that's a co-ed base. And there isn't always food that he can eat that meets his kashrut standards. And so it's been a little bit harder. After we left there, we went to the site of the Supernova Music Festival, which I think all of you know was a major location for slaughter on October 7th. And the site of the music festival is at Kibbutz Reim, which we're going to talk about Kibbutz Reim in a little bit. It's in their sort of parking lot area. Parking lot's not a great term, but it's this beautiful, gorgeous nature area with tons of trails and people picnicking usually. It's a beautiful spot for a music festival, surrounded by gorgeous fields and nature. One of the things that was amazing about when we were there is it was all these kalaniot, these red, I think they're red poppies. I don't know the English floral name, but they're called kalaniot. They come up in spring every year, and there's a big festival called Dromadome, Red South, every year that celebrates the budding of these kalaniot. And it's a beautiful site with just fields of these pops of red everywhere. But this year, obviously, they took on a completely different meaning. Droma Dome, Red South, takes on a different meaning as well. And these Kalaniot, which this field is directly next to the Nova stage area, just really evoked, you know, the thought of the blood and that was shed in these fields just 4 months before. It was a really moving, again, the duality just of the beauty and the horror that exists in the same time. These are just a few pictures of what the memorial looks like. And I think you can get a sense of, you know, each person who was killed there has their own spot. And it does sort of look like, as you're walking through, these people are just dancing. And this is, you can see that white tent in the background. That's where the stage was. And these are where they were dancing and where they were killed just for dancing. One of the things that also stood out, again, there were no tourists or foreigners at that point. Everyone else who was at the memorial site with us were either soldiers or police officers or family members of victims. There was one mom who was standing next to her son's photo and was sharing with people about him as people came by. Rabbi Mark Baker, who is the CEO of CJP, was there the week after me. And he said of the experience of being there that you can really feel the remnants of joy in this holy, hellish place where teenagers were mowed down while joyously dancing. And I think that really sort of encapsulated for me what it was. It was a holy, hellish place. And you could really see both the sense of joy. The photos that families had chosen for their memorials were all of their kids smiling and really seeming just full of life. This picture I included because it's the field right behind that area where the main festival spot was, the dancing spot. And I just think it gives you a sense of what the area surrounding it looks like and how really there was nowhere to run or hide from the people who were, from the attackers, from the terrorists who came in. There were people landing by, you know, parachute into here and just gunning people down. And I think for me, my experience of standing there is just, you can really imagine. And there was heavy artillery while we were standing there. There were constant explosions and just really viscerally felt that fear of like, I can imagine running through my life and not having anywhere to go and just feeling completely exposed. This is a video there. I'm showing this video. It has frequent loud explosions in the background because that's what it was like when we were there. And I think it's hard to sort of articulate what that felt like. And so, you know, you can hear it. And I think you can imagine for yourselves what it was like to be there for me and for the people who were there on October 7th. I will say, again, this has louder explosions. If that's going to be hard for you to hear, I would encourage you to mute your computer so you don't hear it. Take care of yourself. You're also going to hear our guide. The person speaking English was our tour guide who had gone with us for the CJP mission, saying, you'll hear her saying, like, there's rockets firing overhead just before an explosion goes off. That wasn't planned. It's just, that's how frequent the explosions were, that it just happened to sort of seem like it aligned with what she was talking about.
Rockets are being fired over their heads, and the splitting gunfire is coming from every direction. And the people who are here didn't realize that in the first moment, before everything started, they were in a peace.
As we were leaving the Nova Festival site, we got back down to the road, and there are these bomb shelters all over, beautifully decorated, various ones donated by various organizations. This is the bomb shelter that was at the bottom, where a lot of festival goers ran to, and they were ambushed on the road when they got there, including Hirsch Goldberg Pollen. Many of you might have heard his story. His parents are very vocal in sharing his story and advocating for hostage release. He was abducted from this specific bomb shelter that was on the road. I think I'm going to skip our experience in Ofakim just for the sake of time. But one of the things that was notable is when we were in Ofakim, standing in the street, this woman and her child came running out of their apartment, and she said, she asked if she could share her story with us. And one of the things that, came up a lot is people really just want to share their story, and she thanked us for coming. People were so grateful that we were there to hear them and to bear witness with that to their pain and share in their pain and hear their stories. We just talked about the Nova Festival being in the Kibbutz Re'im area on their land. We were very lucky to meet with a member of Kibbutz Re'im in their new home. This is their temporary relocation home. It's in the heart of Tel Aviv, a very different background than the birds chirping and the flowers blooming. Their noise now is all construction and traffic and horns beeping. Very different environment than what any of them are used to. Kibbutz Re'im was initially evacuated to a hotel in Eilat, and they lived there for 2 months until CJP, the Boston Jewish Federation, actually was able to locate and pay for these three buildings, actually, these 2 apartment buildings next to each other that were large enough to accommodate the 400 members of the kibbutz. And the reason they agreed to move to this location, despite it being so different than what they're used to, is because of this building, this little building in the middle of the 2 apartment buildings that they were able to also use as a community center. There's a preschool there now, but just a very sort of big move for them to a different thing. Again, there was this theme of private citizens and international Jewry stepping up in a way that the government had not, in that CJP funded this kibbutz, is relocation. And when we had gotten there, the government had just started paying the rent 4 months after they were initially evacuated from their kibbutz. This is Zohar. Zohar is one of the 2 people who I think was the most moving for me to talk to, and who really, really were big parts of my experience there and what I've held on to. She's a social worker. I'm a social worker, and I just found our conversation to be with her and how freely she shared, not just of her experience of October 7th, which everyone freely shared, but of the intricacies of the challenges she's faced afterwards in just her shattering of identity and core beliefs and ideologies, and the things that I think I had similarly experienced to a much lesser extent, but she put words for, words to, and I think I related a lot to her. And so she was speaking with her was very powerful for me. I'm not going to tell you her entire story just for the sake of time, but just some background information. She has 3 children. One of them has autism. He's a teenager, and her husband is a farmer. Kibbutz Re'im is a farming community, and her husband is actually living on the kibbutz now, has returned with their son with autism because it was too hard for him to disrupt his routine after they evacuated, and he doesn't experience fear in the way that other people do, and so he doesn't have that same fear of being there. And for him, it's much more regulating to be in his own home and to have his routine, and his dad is there with him, Zohar's husband, because he is a farmer, and you can't let a farm not be tended to, or you don't just lose the current crops, but you also lose a lot of potential future crops. And so he is there caring for their son and caring for their farm in the hopes that they'll be able to return one day. One of the more haunting things that Zohar shared that hadn't even occurred to me until she shared it was that a lot of the people who worked on the farms with her husband and all of their friends were the Thai workers, many of whom were abducted and were released in the first round of hostage releases. Many of those Thai workers were from Kibbutz Re'im, and a lot of Gazan workers, a lot of Gazan civilians who came in every day and worked the fields with them, and who they had considered friends and colleagues and coworkers and people who they had known for years. And she said, she doesn't know, she was in her safe room and she survived, obviously. So she doesn't know if the people who came to kill them specifically were the people who worked on their farm. But what she does know is that Hamas had such detailed maps of everybody's house and every family member and every dog and everything on their kibbutz. And she knows that information came from the people who worked on their kibbutz alongside them for years. And that sense of betrayal and breaking of trust was so damaging for her, and I think really stuck with me too. One of the other things that Zohar said about the Gazans who they had worked alongside with is they really saw themselves as peacemaking people. They were people who hired people from Gaza. They were building relationships with people. They spent, for them to regain that sense of ability to even think about peace. She also said that she spent a lot of time talking about the government and how the betrayal from the government was in ways even worse than the betrayal from Hamas, because it's their own government that's supposed to protect them. And not only did they not protect them, but they also took them so long to respond, and even now to support the community, not just financially, but the government is saying it's safe to go back, you need to go back. And she's saying, how can we trust them that it's safe? We don't feel it's safe. So that was a theme that came up as well. She described that sense of betrayal from the government as not just being disappointing and frustrating like other people had, but as a real barrier to recovery and a barrier, an obstacle to rehabilitation for them, because they're being asked to go and rebuild their lives in the place where they were killed. And she said the people who were killed in Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen weren't asked to go build lives in those places. They moved to Israel, or they moved to the US or to other countries. And for them, this idea of returning to where their lives ended, literally and metaphorically, and having to rebuild there just feels impossible. Especially if they can't trust the government to keep them safe in the future anymore. And children don't trust their parents to keep them safe in their own homes anymore, and how hard that is to think about even returning. I also